Okay.
Yep, that works.
The event's live.
Hi, everybody. Let's just wait another minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Just need a couple more people to kind of hop on real quick, but glad you all were able to join us. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we have a couple more people that we are expecting, but we'll go ahead and run through a couple things just to get started. So first of all, thanks everybody for joining again. We'll run through the agenda real quick. We just want to first make sure that we have everybody. But I think if we have Ashley here real quick, I'll let her kick it off. Are you here, Ashley?
I am. Hi, everyone. How are you guys?
Good.
Well, great. Good to see you all again. I really enjoyed the meeting last week. Thank you for all of your opinions. I feel like I learned a lot, and I think we had a great, robust discussion. So good to see you guys. Molly, did you want me to start with the PowerPoint or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, you want me to share it? All right, everybody should be able to see my PowerPoint.
Okay, great. So we've got the agenda in front of us. You'll see we're going to start with introductions, and I'll do a quick roll call so everybody can weigh in and we can kind of check your mics. Then we're going to talk about the purpose and ground rules for this meeting. Then we will, I'll turn it over to Molly and she'll go over the meeting format. We'll talk about goals for implementation. She will introduce topic 2 about marijuana hospitality program. We will revisit topic 1, then we'll talk about how the public can present public comments and then go to next steps. So next slide, please, Molly. So why don't we do this to check everybody's mics? I will just do the roll call. You guys just say hi. I'll say who you're affiliated with. I'm Ashley Kilroy. I'm the co-chair of the committee and I work for Denver Excise and Licenses. And Molly Molly Duplashane is the executive director of Denver Excise and Licenses, and she's the co-chair of the committee. And I think your mic is working.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, very good. And Councilwoman Black from District 4, are you on the call?
She was not able to join today.
Okay. Councilwoman Sita Baca is from City Council District 9. Councilwoman Sita Baca, are you on the call? Okay. So, and let's see, next we'll go to Councilman Chris Hines. Councilman Hines from District 10, are you with us?
Good afternoon. Yes, I am.
Hi, how are you? Very good.
Well, I'm just fine. Thank you. How are you?
Good, good. Kenneth Allison from All About Hemp. I saw you earlier. Is your mic working well?
Believe it is.
Okay, good, good. And Anshul Baga from the City Attorney's Office?
Yep, I'm here.
Anshul, are you on?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. It's a little low. All right, next, John Bailey from BCEI, the Black Cannabis Equity Initiative. John, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great, great. John had earlier said he might be a little late. John, I understand you did you had a podcast yesterday, and I know you invited me, and I had another meeting, but I know Bea listened to it and said it was great. Do you want to give the group a quick update on your podcast? Because it was all about equity in cannabis.
Sure. Yesterday, we had a great opportunity to bring some folks under one tent to sort of talk about the social equity piece, not only as related to cannabis, but we started off dealing with equity in education, equity in city government, state government. We looked at the business community, and then we transitioned towards a panel discussion on equity in the cannabis landscape, sort of a sense of where we are. I put it together. Cindy Sovine, Larissa Bolivar, Truman Bradley, Joe Megacy, all participated in the panel and did an outstanding job in terms of trying to move the needle, trying to bring us all under one tent. There are some social equity definitions floating around out there that I think are going to be very good, that Sarah Woodson and I believe Wanda James and Samantha and some others are working on. So this discussion really is to try to move us all towards one direction under one tent so that we can be helpful at the state level, and definitely to try to support the work that you're doing, Ashley and Molly, and the members of the work group are doing locally. We'll continue to do this. We'll continue to be at the forefront. I mean, I've said before that the Black Cannabis Equity Initiative is going to jump in the driver's seat. We are 9 years and $8 billion late. Somebody has to do the work. Not saying that I'm anything special, but saying that I am going to drive this vehicle and move us in the direction I think we need to be going. And so with that, I appreciate the opportunity just to share.
Great, great. Well, thanks for doing that. I'll try to, was it recorded? Can I listen to it later, or should I probably just chat with Bea about what all was said?
I think we will have to chat. If there was a shortcoming, as we didn't get it recorded. Several other people have asked for it because they couldn't participate. But going forward, we've talked about trying to make sure that all of this is recorded so that folks can have a library of information to go to. And if I might, while I have a moment, Truman and Joe did a really outstanding job representing industry concerns and sharing a perspective in terms of being able to move us in a direction that the industry could be moving, because I think a lot of this work needs to come from them, even though, folks like you and Lou Cordova at the state level can pull us together. I think that the industry is going to have to step up, and these young men are talking the talk, and I need to make sure that we support what they're doing.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. I will sit down with Bea a little longer and hear a little bit more about it. Sarah Belstock from Denver Health and Hospital Authority, are you on the call?
I am. Good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. And I think I saw Truman from the Marijuana Industry Group when I first jumped on.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Truman. Diane Cooks from Montbello, are you on the call? Sean Coleman from 36 Solutions, I think I did see you as well. Are you on the call, Sean?
Did you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, good afternoon.
Very good. Hi there. Jacqueline Flug from Drizzly, are you on the call? I saw you too. Jacqueline. Very good. All right, well, when I come back, I'll see if I missed anybody. We can see other people jump in. Michelle Garcia, who's from the Mayor's Office of Social Equity and Innovation. Michelle, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Great, hello. Michelle Holine from Denver Public Schools.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Michelle, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. And I see Andrew Howard, are you on the call from the police department?
I am.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Clarissa Kreck, I did see you from National Cannabis Industry Association. Are you still there?
Hey, nice to see everyone.
Yeah, good to see you. Henny Lastly from Smart Colorado.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello. Jason Moore from the City Attorney's Office.
Hi, everyone. Happy to join.
Hey. Dan Pabone from Medicine Man Technologies.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, everyone.
Hi. And Jessica Scardina from Vincente Cedarburg. Are you with us?
Hi, yes, I'm here. How are you?
Good. Ian Sieb from Governor Polis's office.
Hi, Ashley. Yes, I'm here.
Hey, good to see you. Ryan Tatum, Cultivated Synergy.
Hey, Ashley. Yep, I'm here. Thank you.
Very good. Art Way from Equitable Consulting.
Yes, hello, I'm here.
Hey, Art. And then Sarah Woodson from The Color of Cannabis.
Hi, everyone. I'm here.
Hi, Sarah. So did I miss anybody? Okay, great. And then viewers, if we have viewers out there watching live, last time we did have quite a few. Any viewers, if you've got questions or you want to receive future updates or just confirm your attendance today, we've got the email address down below at that screen. It's marijuanainfo@denvergov.org. So just send an email and let us know you're on the call, and you want to, if you just do that, we'll know you're there and put you on the list to get more updates. So, and now I'm just going to switch to, Molly went over some of this before, just revisit our purpose and ground rules. I think it's always good for us to get our mind right, especially when we haven't been meeting for 2 weeks now. But the purpose is to review and discuss and make recommendations on policy direction and possible marijuana licensing laws, rules, and regulations. The Marijuana Advisory Group is advisory in nature. Work group members will review and discuss options for specific regulatory topics and provide comments and recommendations to the city. The city may then incorporate that input into a future proposal for adoption, and any ordinance changes will require approval by City Council and will go through the whole council process. Another thing to always keep in mind, I think it was really valuable at the last meeting, is just to remember, we all come to the table with different areas of expertise, and each member of the marijuana licensing work group is an equal participant in the process and has an equal opportunity to voice opinions and contribute ideas. And just as with all other advisory work groups, we're not necessarily going to try to work towards consensus. Rather, we want to hear all your input. We love hearing the give and take. We love hearing the competing ideas, and we will use that input to develop a proposal to bring to the mayor and city council. Our work group members, you guys, must accept responsibility to come to the meetings prepared for discussions, and you must commit to treating each other with respect, civility, courtesy, whether or not you agree with each other's interests and concerns. And I think that's no problem. We had a really great, robust meeting last week, and everybody, I think, really enjoyed the conversation. I did hear that one or two people felt like they had a hard time jumping in and answering a question. So as we go through, Molly will maybe monitor the chat a little bit more, and if she sees someone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, she may skip around a bit. So, oh, and I just saw Jacqueline Flug sits in the chat that she's here. Hi, Jacqueline, is your microphone working? Well, maybe that's the issue. Maybe her microphone is not working, but Jacqueline's here. Okay, Molly, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. So let me kind of move to the next slide real quick. Just a couple of more reminders around the meeting format. We put in, as you guys saw, some questions for background and for purposes of discussion, and so we'll run through those. Everybody was sent a copy of the presentation and the agenda last Friday, so hopefully you've had a quick minute to review everything. We'll try to get through as much as we possibly can, but if we miss something or you feel like we don't spend enough time on a particular topic, feel free to submit additional comments in writing. After the meeting last time, we sent out kind of a template for work group members and the public to use, which basically just listed the discussion questions and provided you an opportunity to fill out in a kind of structured way comments on each of the discussion questions. It's not necessary that you use that template, but feel free to use that if that helps you structure your comments a little bit. Along those same lines, we did have some technical issues with the public comments that we posted online last week, and so those were removed for a little bit, but they should be up there again now. So if you're going to the website, where it has all the information for the meeting, the minutes from these meetings, the agendas and presentations from these meetings, there should be an updated link from the public comments from the first meeting. So take a look at that if you're interested. Just a couple of reminders for everybody. Let's keep we'd like to keep the chat function to just queuing people to speak if we need to jump in there. That way we're not getting distracted with some of the conversation that might happen in a chat. So if you feel like, feel free to jump in if you have a question or a response to one of the questions. But if you feel like you're not getting a chance to hop in, just put in the chat that you have a question or a comment, and we'll kind of queue you that way. As Ashley said, we want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to speak and provide their input. So if I see somebody mention in the chat that they have a question and we haven't heard from them as much as some other people, I might kind of skip around and not go in order because we just want to give everybody an opportunity to chime in. So use that chat function for that purpose if you'd like. Another reminder is to make sure before you speak, you announce yourself for a couple of reasons. One, for the viewing public that maybe is joining in late, they might not know which group or organization you're associated with, so it would be nice for them to know who's speaking. Also, it helps Bia, who's operating the camera, know who to move the camera to. So please just announce your name at the beginning, right before you begin speaking. And I think that, oh, and one last reminder, please, to everybody, just to remember to keep your phone on mute if you're not talking. I know that can lead to some accidental talking to yourself when you're muted and you think you're unmuted, but please, it helps with background feedback and echoing. So just please remember to keep your phone or computer on mute if you're not speaking. I think that's it. And just a reminder to the public, the link and the email is down there for where to send your public comment. And again, that template is out there for you to use as well. And just one more reminder, this is from the first presentation as well, just a reminder of our goals for implementation. We want to be thoughtful and responsible in our implementation of these potential new license types. We want to meet the needs of the residents, businesses, and visitors and ensure the health, safety, and well-being of our city, always looking through all of this with a lens for equity. So that's going to be a big piece of our conversation in every meeting, but particularly today and next week as well. So I think with that, we'll jump into the background of the hospitality license. For some background on hospitality, in November 2016, the Denver Cannabis Consumption Program was approved by Denver residents with a citizen-initiated ordinance, Initiative 300. In June of 2017, the Department of Excise and Licenses adopted agency rules to supplement the ordinance. So the ordinance passed by voters in November. We spent maybe 3 or 4 months from January through April developing those rules and adopted those in June of 2017. The ordinance and the rules granted Denver businesses the ability to apply for a cannabis consumption license. What that license allows for is adult marijuana consumption in designated areas, either within a permanent establishment or at a special event. And all these links here take you to the rules and the ordinance and give you some background and descriptions on what our current license structure looks like for cannabis consumption. In May of 2019, the Colorado General Assembly passed House Bill 19-1230, which created 2 new licenses, one for marijuana hospitality establishments and one for marijuana hospitality and sales establishments. And the Marijuana Enforcement Division then adopted some agency rules to supplement that state law. So we now have that as an additional guidance for us as well, if looking towards where to go next in Denver with cannabis consumption. So to review what those what was passed in that bill in 2019, there was 2 different license types, which actually kind of results in 3 different models. Under the one license type for marijuana hospitality, just hospitality, there's the hospitality establishment, and then there's a mobile hospitality establishment. So under just the hospitality, it allows for consumption of marijuana by adult patrons within a permanent licensed premise. However, it does not allow for sales of marijuana to occur in that establishment. And then you have the mobile hospitality establishment, and that allows for consumption of marijuana by adult patrons within a mobile licensed premise, but it still does not allow for sales of marijuana to occur within that licensed premise. And so, you know, mobile means like buses and that type of thing. And then the other type of license that was made available through this bill was a hospitality and sales establishment. And that allows for consumption by adult patrons within a permanent licensed premise, and limited sales of marijuana are permitted on that type. So we created this little chart here to go into a little bit more detail about what each of those models are, because I think it can get a little bit confusing. So we highlighted some of the key features of each of those models and kind of identified which components go with which model. So first we have the state hospitality, and then mobile hospitality, the hospitality and sales, and then our current city designated consumption license. And so you'll kind of see this color coding throughout the presentation associated with the 3 different types of state models. But to go through each of the components on these license types, or these models. So the first one is a needs and desires hearing, and whether getting a license requires a needs and desires hearing. So we currently do require a needs and desires hearing for our designated consumption area license. It is an automatic required hearing for our permanent establishments for designated consumption areas. And so for that reason, and because we have a needs and desires hearing for our marijuana stores as well, we would require one for a hospitality license as the state model has it. 21 and over is required for all the different types of models. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, if the establishment is able to sell marijuana, is only allowed in the hospitality and sales model created by the state in 2019. So in the hospitality or mobile hospitality and under our current city consumption license, sales of marijuana is not allowed. However, on the flip side, consumption of marijuana that a patron brings for themselves is only allowed, is not allowed at the hospitality and sales license model. However, it is allowed in the hospitality, mobile hospitality, and our current consumption area. So it's that bring your own cannabis model is allowed, except for in the hospitality and sales license. Whether patrons may consume marijuana that they purchased at the establishment, again, is only allowed at the hospitality and sales license. Methods of consumption when we're looking at smoking and vaping and whether it may be permitted or not, this is something we'll get into in one of the discussion questions later on in the presentation. But currently smoking and vaping, currently the current city designated consumption area license is required to comply with the Clean Indoor Air Act, which restricts smoking and vaping from occurring. And then under the state model, local jurisdictions can choose to exempt these establishments from the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act. So that's a conversation that we will be having. That's why it says it may be permitted at those locations. Obviously, the mobile hospitality one allows for mobile establishments, but that is the only one that allows for that mobile establishment. But we do, under our current designated consumption area, have an allowance for special events, which doesn't exist under any of the state models. So at this point, I think we'll hop into the first question, but we'll also take it, if anybody wants to chime in with questions around any of that background information, we can do that here as well. But the first question is whether Denver should opt in to allow for marijuana hospitality at businesses. And when we're posing this question, we're posing it for all three types of models. I think we have the option and the flexibility to talk about if we want to opt into one or all three or a variation of the two. And so just want to put that out there that this question is not just for all or nothing. It's, we can take some variations on that as well. Just like in the previous presentation, we've listed the considerations down at the bottom. Under the current city law, the model that most closely resembles what we have right now is that first one, the marijuana hospitality establishments, where it's a BYOC model, and there are no sales that occur. And then the other questions and considerations that are there are public health, public safety, the impacts on youth of these types of places, including underage usage, access for the youth, and then perception of risk. Revenue impacts to both businesses and the city, especially if we're talking about hospitality and sales locations. Opportunities for new market entrants. So looking towards, can we provide some new opportunities with maybe different lower barriers to entry, and then obviously customer, patient, and visitor interest. So I'll pause there and open it up for discussion and questions. Anybody want to jump in?
I'm still here with National Industry Association. The only thing here, and this is a known fact to most of us sitting here, is that, and in the community at large, is that the models for the consumption sites with no sales weren't very viable from a profitability perspective. So this is just something to note for any one business for our discussions, whether or not this should continue, considering we haven't seen any businesses thrive in that model. And Ryan with Cultivated will be able to elaborate on that better than I can.
Yeah, Ryan from Cultivated. Oh, sorry. Okay, I was saying, yeah, Ryan from Cultivated Center. Yeah, first, that's definitely a good point. And I know one thing that was talked about at the state side as well is just, yeah, the restraints around it, and more so just really being able to have a viable model and bringing the revenue to make a rounded business with kind of some of the specifications around that. However, most of that's from the state, so as we know, for the moment, we can't be changing that in this conversation, but it is something good to know and think about.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Woodson with The Color of Cannabis. Can you hear me? Okay. So a couple things. The question was, should we allow for the hospitality model to be opted in through Denver? And that would absolutely be a yes. I feel like I'm echoing. So from a social, okay, thank you. So from a social equity perspective, we definitely want to see opportunities for social equity candidates to come in through the hospitality model. But I kind of want to just talk about some of the considerations. The biggest thing that I would like to ask the city and just everyone on the phone call to think about is, are we going to require hospitality businesses to have the social consumption permit as well as the state permit and the city permit? So will there be 3 permits required, or will it just all be for the state? And the reason why I ask that is because I-300 is kind of conflicting with what the state has set up, because I-300 wants you to have a designated area in your space to consume, but the state doesn't require that. So that would be one of the first things that I just want to kind of point out with regards to consideration on that.
Molly, before you move on, can I just remind everybody to please remember to turn your microphone off if you're not speaking? I'm having to turn everybody's microphones off on my side.
Yep, and I think there's also confusion around the chat, just making sure everybody's on the chat from today's meeting so we don't have 2 chats going, but just make sure if you want to leave a comment, make sure you're in today's chat rather than last week's chat. So Sarah, I'm not quite sure I understand your concern. Can you reiterate that a little bit? So you're just wondering whether you would need to have a current designated consumption area license in addition to the state permits, or whether we would kind of.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if people that want to open this business in Denver are going to be required to have the current I-300 consumption license in order to apply for the state license. And my biggest concern with that is, and just from having a social consumption space, the way that the I-300 is written, it's like a designated space. And so technically you're supposed to have a designated space where people can smoke or vape, either one, which we'll talk about later. But that's hard to have a business model for consumption and then ask for there to be only a designated space where you can consume. So that's just one of my biggest concerns so far.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I think we would try to address that through development of what an ordinance would look like, that we would bring it through and find, create some alignment. We wouldn't require 3. We would find some alignment between the hospitality and our current designated consumption area.
Thank you.
And then I think we had Sean next.
Sean next, and then Jessica.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I'll be brief. I mean, I would echo some of Sarah's comments. I think I said a lot of those same things myself last time, that I think that these license classes present some of the best opportunities for equity because it's a new market segment. So therefore, new market participants. I think there's lots of opportunities for independent entrepreneurship as well as collaboration with existing businesses. So for those reasons, I would my recommendation would be the city move forward with all 3 license classes, and then with that this be an area where if there's any thought about preserving certain licenses for equity applicants or things like that in these license classes, we really look at those opportunities here.
Okay. Jessica.
Hi, Jessica Scardina with Vicente Cedarburg. I agree with Sean that I would advocate for permitting all 3 license types in the city. But I wanted to go back to what I think Clarissa mentioned with respect to the non-sales establishments. I think one of the issues with I-300 was that the pretty strict locational requirements for these businesses had quite an effect on how many people were able to apply, because there was a really limited amount of places in the city where they could be located. I think this had a big impact on the viability of those businesses. So I would suggest too, keeping in mind how to make these licenses viable when working with setbacks and considering what types of zoning might be required. Those other issues definitely play a part in how viable these license types are. I think that these licenses have the potential to really benefit the city with respect to tax revenues and cutting down on public consumption. And so I think that it would be a good step for Denver to take.
So when you guys are saying you support all three license types, are you including and keeping the DCA model through the initiated ordinance?
Since that's the most closely aligned with the non-sales hospitality license, and it was passed by about 54% of the voters, and I would say yes.
Yeah. And I don't know why we wouldn't, except it might be a little confusing. And just one thing, if we were to not do that, we would need a super majority of council to overturn it because it was an initiated ordinance. So that would be
I think Sarah's point that does.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think to Sarah's point, she was just saying that could create some confusion unless you just stuck to one type of model. But I think that's something that we can kind of work through the details. And I don't know if Anshul wants to chime in here at all as far as how that would work legally and once we actually get to drafting. But I think it's mostly a drafting issue more than a, talking about which model.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
I think you're right, Molly. I'll have to double check, but I believe that, so for example, if we were to amend the current DCA code, which is in 6300, and replace it with hospitality only licenses with all the ordinance provisions that would be in place for hospitality only, I think we could do that. Additionally, we could repeal and replace it with the same thing. Both would require a supermajority, though, I think is what Ashley said. I would have to double check on that supermajority thing. I know there's a 6-month window there, and I don't remember what rules apply to which part of the 6-month window. So I can double check while we're on the rest of the call and come back with a better answer.
Thanks, Anshul.
Sure.
Any other comments from the group on just the general opting in or, the all three models versus one or the other?
Yeah,
all three.
No, go ahead, Ryan.
That was just gonna be my input, just supporting all three. I mean, especially as we're kind of really touching on the surface of where the confusion would be, just making sure the language is clear, but then also, in my opinion, from others I've talked to on the mobile side, brick and mortar, everything in between, is rolling it out together really presents an actual rounded opportunity for people to get in and to really have a wider door for people to get involved, both on the equity side and new business, new entrants. Whereas the more we single them down when really they're all achieving the same end goal, it just adds some more limitations there. But just to keep it straightforward as possible, but that's always the goal, I know.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is Art Way, Equitable Consulting. Opt in to all three, but I don't know the vehicle that you all need to use to make this happen, but I think Denver's laws need to be at least as permissive as the state. So I don't know if that's repeal and replace or somehow figure out a way to keep the DCA in place and ensure that what you have in the city is as permissive as what the state offers.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, it looks like Councilman Hines has a comment.
Yes, Chris Hines, Denver City Council. I had to echo Mr. Tatum's comment about making sure that we have access, including equity access. I would caution about we don't want to make policy decisions based on business models, so to speak. And so, I mean, I think what people are getting at is more about access. But I would just say I would encourage people to think more on the lines of access more than access to the people rather than profitability for businesses. Thank you.
Great, yeah, and I think we'll have some good discussion around that when we get to the slide around proximity requirements. So I think we have, we got a couple. We got Truman, Ian, and Henny. So let's go with Truman.
Truman Bradley, Marijuana Industry Group. With respect to Councilman Hines, I would disagree because as far as, policy not considering business models, I think the way I-300 got rolled out is a pretty clear fail. It just doesn't work. It's virtually impossible to make money doing this, and that's why there are so few of them in conjunction with the zoning. And so why go through all this trouble if it's impossible to make money? People won't do it. And so, from a social equity lens, if new applicants have a license but they can't benefit from it, it's kind of useless. And so I totally understand the access for patients. I get that, but it takes both sides, and good policy should incorporate that.
So then, this is Ashley Kilroy. So Truman, are you saying you would not support the hospitality without sales, or you think we should consider not doing that?
I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I just would never do it as a business person because I don't know how to make it worth my time, to be honest with you. So like, if other people feel great about it and have thought of something that I haven't, I mean, good luck to them, and I wish them all the success. I just don't know how to make money doing it, and I've been in this business for 10 years, so to me, it's kind of a moot point.
And I don't think from our end that there's any downside sort of from a regulatory system or an administrative system, Molly, for maybe having one license type that's not as popular as the other, except for people being confused about what they're applying for. Mm-hmm. Is that what you think? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously some would be more inviting than others, but I mean, I think we want to make the right policy decision too. So let's see, we had Ian and then Henny.
Thank you, Molly. Speaking strictly from the state standpoint, obviously I have intimate knowledge as it relates to 300, but in my role here at the state, I'm not here to opine on 300 in any capacity. I will tell you that from hospitality and delivery, the state's excited about any local jurisdiction that wants to engage in hospitality and delivery. We're actively working with other local jurisdictions, meeting with them and talking about ways that we can move this forward. The hope is that local jurisdictions would consider this, but of course they need to do what's best for them. But the state is fully willing to support and work with any local jurisdictions that wish to employ either of these.
Henny?
Yes, hi, Henny Lastly with Smart Colorado. Earlier in the conversation, there was a reference to a claim that this is going to pull people out of the public consumption world being outside. And I guess I would like to know if there's any data that's been done to support that claim, that this is going to take people off the streets and out of the parks to actually come into a consumption area. And then I guess the second thing I would want to ask from the city is if that's actually, if the data is present when we're considering the policy around this, will there be a step up from the enforcement of open and public consumption outside of the consumption areas by DPD or whomever? So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
That's a good question. Lieutenant Howard, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that from your perspective.
That's going to be hard to say. We're just going to have to determine, and really that's going to be something that's complaint based. I can't imagine that we're going to have officers in the area standing by for that reason. However, if we did receive a complaint of that, just like we do now at the parks, at times for consumption of alcohol or consumption of marijuana, so that would likely be something that would be complaint based.
Okay. there'll be plenty of time to kind of keep chiming in on this, but I think the next slide is pretty related to it. So I think we'll move on to the next slide. If I can quickly share my slides again. Let's see. So the next question along those same lines is barriers to entry and equity considerations. And if we opted in to all three types of models, or one or more of the models, what barriers to entry exist for these types of establishments, and what should be some of the equity considerations that we think about? So barriers to entry such as access to capital and startup costs, including the application and licensing fees, other types of legal barriers and challenges, community engagement requirements. So one of the requirements of the current designated consumption license is a requirement that the applicant obtain evidence of community support. So they have to have at least one registered neighborhood organization or business improvement district provide a letter of support, or at least non-opposition, in order to be able to even just get the application in the door. That was part of the citizen-initiated ordinance when it passed in 2016. So an interesting concept there. Public hearing requirements, caps or limitations on the number of licenses available is another discussion point when we're talking about entry or barriers to entry. Number of licenses for new market entrants is a concept that has been proposed by some here. And then scaling and sequencing of licensing, just kind of like we talked about with delivery, thinking about the three types of models, and if opted in, is there an order in which that would create lower barriers to entry and equity possibilities. So I'll stop there and see who wants to start our conversation.
Hello, this is Ken with All About Hemp. When you talk about community support, are you talking about a certain number of people, or you need the okay of a square block?
So the way that the current ordinance works is that you just have to have somebody within a designated area. And so, well, actually, I think what it says is a registered neighborhood organization or BID that overlaps where this establishment would be, would just have to provide a letter of support or a letter of non-opposition. So they either have to say, yes, we support this, or no, or we at least just don't oppose it. Remember too, we are assuming they would have a needs and desires hearing. So if there was strong opposition, that would be a possibility at a needs and desires hearing, but currently a designated consumption license in Denver does require that evidence of community support just to get the application submitted. We're not, and that's we're talking about barriers to entry right now, and so interested to hearing if that's a barrier to entry, or if we think that's a good model, or any other barriers to entry that we should be considering when we're considering equity as a part of this license model.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Woodson, Color Cannabis. So with regards to license distribution on this, we would be recommending the same thing, a 1-for-1 on hospitality license distributions. When it comes to barriers to entry, though, I really would like the city and the work group to take into consideration zoning. One of the things that Councilwoman Cedabaka had mentioned on our last call was how high her specific district has a concentration of retail stores. And a lot of that has to do with zoning. And just from personally running this business, I can tell you that the zoning piece is a huge barrier to entry. If you find a landlord that's open to the idea, 9 times out of 10, the zoning won't work. And that can be the zoning with regards to the actual district, or the way that currently I-300 is set up, where there's the 1,000-foot setback. And the biggest problem with that specific setback is daycares in Denver. So those, to me, outside of just the normal things, capital that you need for every business, The 1,000-foot setback when it comes to daycare facilities is a huge barrier to entry. And then just the zoning in general. You can only have these businesses in a lot of warehouse districts, which doesn't make it really accessible to the public and hard for people to access, especially if we're talking about wanting to have these so people can get out of parks and smoking in parks. We definitely should think about changing some of the zoning. And I don't know how complicated that would be, but I think it's something that needs to be considered. Thank you.
Ryan Tatum with Cultivated Synergy. I actually second that. I was going to bring something up along that same line, and also kind of in that same vein with the cap and the number of license. Between all the things that were just mentioned, going through a local organization, Denver isn't but so big anyway. Really is putting a cap on that as well necessary at this step, where to kind of let it flow some, allow the county and let the city, because of all the other barriers of finding the appropriate building, getting the approval, let that really be the first buffer with kind of seeing how many can even really fit in here and where we can find the areas. Again, if the goal is really to spread it out, people are going to run to the quickest place, try to get them set up, but is that really achieving the goal of spreading them out and opening the barriers of entry so more people can access and get to these spaces? Because I too have looked into Cultivated, starting back with I-300. We're very interested in all of these pieces. I don't think that's any secret, but yeah, it's difficult enough just finding a place to be able to do it. And so keeping that in mind, and then the number 2 to go all the way down that road, and this is hypothetical, say there's only 10 lights, that's just one more barrier really at the moment. I understand we don't want hundreds every block, but just kind of let the market decide that at first on its own initially, and with the community organization approvals.
So because I think we'll really get into the conversation around proximity requirements. We have 2 slides actually dedicated to that, and I think we'll try to make sure we save ample amount of time to get into that, because I think that's where a lot of our conversations and the input that we've received over the last couple of years have come from. And a lot, and as Sarah mentioned, a lot of that comes from zoning requirements, and we can talk a little bit more about that when we get to that slide, and just make sure we understand the differences between the zoning requirements and the proximity requirements that are currently in place for the I-300 licenses. But before we move to that slide, any other barriers of entry that we should consider or think through outside of proximity requirements that
Molly, we have Sean and Jessica on queue.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And Henny. Oh, never mind. Yep, just Sean and Jessica. Go ahead, Sean. Oh, are you on mute, Sean? There you go. Oh, you're back to mute again.
Let me do it, Sean. I can override you.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I won't touch anything else. So my thoughts on I agree with Sarah's comments that there should be, that this is a good opportunity to have some license set aside. I don't know if 1-to-1 is the right number per se. I don't know what the proportionality be, and that goes to my second comment, that I also do not believe at the beginning that there should be license caps. License caps have, if they become limited, of course, they become more valuable. So if it's more valuable to have, then that's going to make it more competitive and less of an equitable opportunity without having to do some other mitigating things and policy, which may not be a great idea. So I don't recommend that. Also, the other important thing to consider from an economic perspective is that since this license type is a new business type, if there isn't a healthy a number of them to generate interest in the activity of going to this type of business, there's not enough variety of types of uses. My concern would be that then none of them would be successful because you never really established a culture. I mean, the reason why you can start, using restaurant as an example, a restaurant's a hard business to start at any time, even when you're talking about an environment where it's post months or perhaps a year of limited and new socialization, which of course any of these businesses necessarily are going to be going into that environment. But the reason you can start a restaurant is because there's going to be at least some base client base, right? There are people like going to restaurants generally, right now we don't know who likes going to this type of business generally. So you want to see a variety of different business types, whether it be entertainment focused, food focused, whatever it is, but to generate the baseline population of people who want to use this service. And so if you don't have the businesses existing, then I think you never get that baseline population of the service. So I think for both, purpose of making sure that businesses are successful, and that there is equity in that there should not be a license cap, and that to the extent that there are license set asides, I don't think 1-to-1 is quite the right number, because I do think you need to have a healthy concentration of the businesses going at the beginning to make all of them be viable.
Jessica Scardina and then John Bailey.
All right, thank you. Jessica Scardina with Vicente Cedarburg. I just wanted to add quickly with respect to barriers to entry. As someone who charges people to conduct public hearings and go through the testimony and do the presentation with them, I can tell you that it is very expensive. So that is a pretty significant barrier to entry. I think the mobile premises has a better potential for lower barriers to entry, and so maybe the city could consider not requiring public hearings, since there wouldn't be a permanent premise that could impact the neighborhood as significantly. It's just a suggestion.
Interesting concept. So next, I think we had John. John Bailey. You might be on mute, John. We can't hear you. Hey, John, we can't, oh, might be off now. We may have to come back to you, John. We can't quite hear you. We'll come back in just a minute, okay? Okay. So any other thoughts on barriers to entry? We can come back to John in just a minute. But right now, any other thoughts on barriers to entry or some equity considerations that we should be thinking through?
Ryan has one more comment.
Okay, Ryan?
Hey, yeah, I'm Taylor with Cultivated Synergy again. One more thing, I guess, in the same vein with capital startup, but I guess to focus in on one would be just any guidance around just the ventilation of these facilities and kind of what that really is going to entail. I mean, it's obviously referenced, but as we all know, can get very expensive very quickly. They know exactly what the people who will be bringing it, what type of system, things of that nature. Any the more the merrier to help with that.
Okay, I heard part of what you said. We lost you for a minute, and you've kind of got an echo going. If you can maybe just submit some written comment on that, that would be helpful.
If you have a headphone, that might also help.
All right, so we'll go ahead and go on to the next question, because I feel like you're wanting to get to the book of here. So let me share my slide, and we'll go on to the next question. So hours of operation. What should be some of the hours of operation for our marijuana, if we opted into marijuana hospitality establishments? And again, we want to talk about all the three different types of models, the just hospitality, a mobile hospitality, and then hospitality and sales. So, and some context here for what's already out there. The Marijuana Enforcement Division rule allows these establishments to operate between the hours of 7 a.m. and 2 a.m. Currently, our I-300 licenses are able to operate between those same hours of 7 a.m. and 2 a.m. However, marijuana stores and centers in Denver are only able to operate between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. And again, remember, one of these models does allow sales to occur. So there would be some misalignment or inconsistency there between stores and centers and hospitality and sales licenses. State liquor code allows establishments for on-site alcohol consumption to operate between the hours of 7 and 2. Some considerations to take into place are public safety, impacts on youth usage, access and perception of risk, revenue impacts to both the city and the businesses, and then customer, patient, and visitor interest. So we'll open that up for conversation. Any thoughts on hours of operation? No, nothing.
So maybe I'll jump in real quickly.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, looking at liquor, because we always kind of regulate like alcohol, right? The state says bars can stay open from 7 in the morning till, 2 at night. But, you know, we always have that balance that we have to walk with neighborhoods, which is why it's really important that we have the needs and desires hearings so neighbors can weigh in. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, but I think we have very few bars, if any, that operate from 7 in the morning till 2 in the evening. So just something to consider, and that also, you know, that's where the GNA, the Good Neighborhood Agreement, comes in to help neighbors give an opportunity to weigh in. And then another thing too, Molly, I was thinking, I remember we one time pulled the data for our needs and desires hearings related to marijuana because we have to do them for stores, and it wasn't too different from liquor where the neighbors are. Do you recall that? Is that about right?
As far as the level of opposition that we receive for those? Yeah, no, I mean, I would say the vast majority of all our licenses that require hearings, very few of them have opposition. And those that do and usually end up with some type of good neighbor agreement. And so the opposition and the applicant end up coming to some type of resolution. And the license still ends up getting granted, even if there is opposition as a result of that good neighbor agreement.
And I would add, it's better for the business in the long run to have had that conversation with your neighbors than to open and have the neighbors call the cops every single night, you know, or call for noise ordinances. So I think it sets up a good way for everybody to be able to talk and build relationships early on.
Sarah, what's in the color of cannabis? When we were working on, well, first of all, I think a big portion of it will be your good neighbor agreement. And what we noticed was that the neighbors were okay with having a more club style hours on like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So they were okay with us staying open till 2 o'clock. But then on a Monday through Wednesday, they wanted us to be shut down by 10. But you know, they were saying, well, we don't want noise, but we want to take into consideration your business. So I think that a happy medium would be if you, and Sean had mentioned like people, or someone mentioned that people don't understand who really visits these businesses. And so a lot of these businesses are visited by tourists. So it's a huge tourist-based business. When we move on in the conversation and we start talking about maybe adding the opportunity to have food involved and different things like that, then you'll start being able to gather more of your local people. But for most of us that have these businesses, it's tourists that visit. So being able to stay open until 2 on a weekend when a tourist is in town and people want to visit is going to be imperative versus earlier on in the week when business is slow. And so those are the things that I would really take into consideration, maybe having a mixture. And then with regards to there being an overlap with if you're going to sell and selling stops at 10, I think that selling should continue to stop at 10, and it would just be required for the person that is having the business to have sales to stop selling at 10. I mean, and if you have this business, that would be something that you'd be required to do. And I think that's fair, at least for the brick and mortar. I don't really deal too much in mobile, but I feel like it could be the same way across the board as well.
Okay, sorry, Sarah. So let me just make sure I was muted. let me just make sure I understand what you're proposing, which is allow the consumption establishments to stay open till 2, but if they're an establishment that has a license to also have sales, that require the sales to stop at 10 to be consistent with stores and centers, but allow the consumption to occur until 2 a.m.
Correct.
Your proposal. Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, this is Dan Pabon,
And
Medicine Man Technologies.
Jessica Scardina is on the queue too, Molly.
I would say.
Okay, yep. So go ahead, Dan, and then we'll go to Jessica.
Okay, just under the state law, you would want to align all of the businesses, and then I just got muted when you muted me. You muted all the lines. So, what I was saying is, and I don't know why there's feedback because I'm on the phone and for the audio. So, sorry about that, everyone. But what I was saying is, you align on the state law, so everything is 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. And then you allow, as Ashley mentioned, the good neighbor agreements to settle out the differences between the nights of the week and, you know, the different geographic locations. I've done, you know, several dozen liquor license hearings in my career, and that's been a way to sort of moderate that between the neighborhood and the establishments pretty effectively. And then it's not a one size fits all. It's as the evenings progress and as the geography changes. So I think you want to align all those so there's not a lot of confusion.
Okay, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you. Jessica Scardina with Vicente Cedarburg. I was basically just going to make the same point that Dan did, that it's better to be consistent with the state and local laws, particularly if the local laws already allow DCAs to be open from 7 to 2. And if the neighbors agree with the business to shorter hours, then that's up to them. But I don't think it's necessary to include that in the ordinance language.
Okay. Let's see. So it looks like we had Truman and then Henny next. So Truman, you're up.
Thanks, Truman Bradley, Marijuana Industry Group. Yeah, Sarah Woodson and others were talking about the challenges with the daycares, and I think that that's relevant for ours as well. And to kind of echo what Jessica just said, you know, daycares wind down, you know, sometime between 3 and 5 p.m. And if these establishments are going to go on in the evening, it's really not relevant. And so, you know, something that just allows with the good neighbor agreement to work it out between the folks that would be impacted or not makes a lot of sense, especially for, you know, again, parks and rec centers, same type of thing, right?
Okay. So Henny, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. So we worked really hard with Denver City Council on the 10 o'clock closure time for stores. So I think, Sarah, I really liked your suggestion about keeping the time for the last sale to remain consistent with the marijuana store that the hospitality area would be associated with. And I'd call on my friends at Denver Public Health and Denver Public Schools to talk about some of the data around additional access of hours and things of that when it comes to kids. So, I think I'm echoing really badly.
Sounds fun. Sarah, would you like to respond to that?
This is Sarah Belsack from Denver Public Health. I think anytime we're considering increasing or having hours is something that should be considered within the context of increasing access and everything that comes along or might come along with that. So it's really the only thing I would say around that. So fewer hours, less access tends to be tied with less use across multiple populations. So youth included.
Okay.
Hey, Molly, it's Ashley.
Yes.
Should we kind of take a second and have Bea tell us, is there something we need to do so we don't all have this echo? Because
If everyone who is on a phone and a computer could just be on a computer, that really be helpful. And I think just making sure your phone is muted, because the echo is when you have two sources of voice incoming.
Okay. Thank you, Bea.
I'm not really hearing an echo, but maybe it's me that's creating it. All right, well, we'll move on at this point. We're moving much quicker than we did at the delivery one, so that's good. So the next question, I believe, is around methods of consumption. So just putting out the question of what methods of consumption should be allowed at marijuana hospitality establishments. Again, all three models the question would be relevant to all three types of models. So some of the requirements and restrictions that are already out there are that the use of liquefied petroleum gas torches is prohibited in designated consumption areas, and I think that's under the state as well. I guess we forgot to kind of include that, but and that is defined as a means of material which is composed predominantly of propane, propylene, butane, isobutane, and butylene. And then under the state law that was passed allowing hospitality establishments, local jurisdictions may allow smoking and vaping at hospitality establishments. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the state bill does allow local jurisdictions to opt into an exemption from the state law of the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act for smoking and vaping of marijuana. It still requires compliance with the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act for smoking and vaping of tobacco indoors, but local jurisdictions do have the option to exempt these establishments from marijuana smoking and vaping from the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act. So want to have that discussion with all of you, especially when it comes to the questions around public health, as well as customer, patient, and visitor interest and how that would impact some of these business models. But also from the public health perspective around these types of consumption methods and the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act. So we'll see who would like to start us off on this one. Let's see. It looks like Councilman Hines has a question.
Yeah, so question about smoking and vaping. If that were to be allowed, would there be regulation regarding ventilation or whatnot, or would we just say, okay? So that's the question. Thank you.
So we had this conversation a little bit when we talked about vaping indoors with designated consumption areas, and I do believe that our rules right now have some ventilation requirements for designated consumption areas, and I would assume that we would want to definitely have that conversation around what those requirements would be, especially considering, I mean, we have the odor requirements for cultivation facilities, and so we'd want to kind of look to anything that we already have existing that could guide us in that path. But and I would turn that question back to everybody else too to say, would you recommend that we do? Sarah, looks like you have a comment.
Yeah, I just think from a public health standpoint, it feels really difficult to roll back a pretty established public health measure with the Clean Indoor Air Act. And I would really caution us to think about the health implications of doing that, both for consumers and as well as for employees that are going to be working in the space. And I think, what we've learned from tobacco is that a lot of the ventilation measures are really insufficient to reduce all of the health risks. So I think we would really want to proceed with a great deal of caution and consideration for the health implications for allowing smoked products.
Okay. Sarah Woodson?
Sarah Woodson, The Color of Cannabis. If you don't allow people to consume combustibles, there is no business model. I want to make that very, very clear. And I can speak that for every single person that does this business. The biggest challenge is people not being able to smoke combustibles. They have to be able to come in. It's a consumption lounge. They have to be able to smoke in the traditional manners and methods that people consume. And that's going to be combustibles. So if Denver decided that they would not opt in to allow that, there would be no valuable business model, no opportunity for social equity people to take advantage of this, because the whole purpose of the business is consumption. So you would need to be able to consume in traditional methods and manners. Thank you.
So Sarah, while I have you, what are your thoughts around ventilation requirements along those lines? Sarah Woodson.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I think the ones in I-300 are good. That was kind of one of my first comments. As long as we're not overlaying I-300 in the new ordinance to have a designated area, the ventilation systems that are required are good. Depending on your square footage, if you have 3 or 4 in there, you can keep your space very well ventilated. So I think what already exists would work.
Okay. Councilman Hines, and then Clarissa and Michelle.
Thank you, Chris Hines, Denver City Council. So I thank you for the comment about how this is moving faster than the last discussion. I would say that my comments are, I had firmer opinions about the last discussion than this one. So, I think that applies to this, what comment I'm about to make too. So I would again, I recognize Meg and Mr. Bradley's caution about business models. I would again say this is about public health, not necessarily about business model. And so I would say allowing smoking in a lounge would be in the interest of public health, because we don't want people smoking in our parks or in our schools near our kids. So we want to give people a place where they don't have to break their lease to consume, and that would be in a spot where that is sanctioned, as long as there is proper ventilation. And so that's the reason I would support smoking and vaping in this particular environment, as long as there's proper ventilation. I would maybe it does affect the business model, and I'm not trying to say that we should ignore business models or profitability. I'm saying that that as a public policy person, I should be considering the public, not the profitability of individual businesses. Thank you.
Clarissa Creek with National Cannabis Association. I don't really have a comment. It's really more of a question. Instead of sidetracking the conversation, Molly and all, I'm going to put this in my comments written wise later. But when I'm looking at the link that you guys shared at the top of this presentation for the cannabis consumption licenses, there is indeed a link that I was researching on an odor control plan that would be required. But when one clicks on that link, it's not leading me anywhere. So that's just something for us. It might be helpful for us to take a look at that, and I can share that with you. And then lastly, you guys, I'm not sure if this was discussed at all, but I just caught this in the same page that a national criminal history records check is required for this license, which is not uncommon. But obviously this is off track. But if we're looking at equity, it would be very difficult for us to fully execute this vision when the license itself requires for federal criminal background check. I believe it's 60 days or less. So just a comment that is not here that I'll make sure to voice in the writing later.
Molly, we have Michelle Garcia, Sean Coleman, Truman Bradley, and John Bailey. So let's start with Michelle.
Hi, Michelle Garcia, Mayor's Office of Social Equity and Innovation. I have a question. If vaping or smoking is allowed, will the use of shared devices be allowed? So in Amsterdam, at the cafes, you can, use shared vaporizers and things like that. I believe there are additional public health requirements in having shared devices. I just didn't know if that was part of the plan and if that's an additional consideration that might be an impediment to people.
So under the current designated consumption area right now, we do allow for shared devices, and it requires, I forget what the terminology is that we use, but basically requires a health sanitation plan or something like that. Obviously, right now, there's going to be stronger concern about something like that than there was 6 months ago. Definitely something that would involve. Was that okay, Michelle? You look scared.
You were just cutting a lot, Molly, your audio.
Okay. Okay, sorry.
So it's
Sean
Coleman and then Truman, yeah. I unmuted you, Sean. You can go. You're good. Whoa, you muted yourself. 1 second. Let me unmute you myself. Just don't touch it.
Nope.
Hey, Sean, I'm having issues with your audio. Let me go to Truman and come back to you. I'm sorry.
I'm good to go. I don't need to say anything. Sorry.
Okay, so go back to Sean. I think we'll go back to all right, let's try one more time, Sean. Okay, Bia, if you could not touch Sean, and then Sean, let's have you unmute yourself.
How about that?
That's great. There you go.
So what I was saying was that I don't think that the first of all, I think that as a matter of the ordinance, all consumption methods should be allowed. I say that I don't believe that the smoking vaping issue is absolutely fatal to all. In fact, I think and I forget who I guess Michelle was talking about in terms of people sharing devices. I think that whether people are smoking or vaping, that people can share devices, that these products are available. I think one of the biggest challenges on the consumer end with vaping, of course, is that so many of the devices and products that you use are, first of all, expensive to purchase as an individual. And then since you're buying it online and then using it at home with no one showing you how to use it, people have terrible experiences. So the presumption is they don't like it because they had this terrible experience. So I do think on the front end, to get people in the door, that people are going to want to smoke. I think that as a consideration for people at different income points, that whether you are providing the device or expecting people to have their own device, that vaping is not free by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, could be quite costly for the individual. But I do think that it's a good way to consume, and I think it will become more popular once people become exposed to it. But for the purposes of making sure that at the beginning that customers can have an experience that they are familiar with, they can become educated with, the ability, I mean, as if they're concerned about people sharing things, a good thing about joint is that it's gone when there's nothing to share, so but I do think that all consumption methods should be allowed. And then finally, to that point, the state law does have a carve out to allow butane and those things. And again, the purpose of that carve out is to allow for people to be able to do dabs of torches and things like that. So that's what that carve out in state law is for. But I do think that at least at the beginning, all consumption methods should be allowed. And I do think that the marketplace will adjust to that. And then the state law also does require, for people concerned about the public health concerns, state law requires not only that there be ventilation, but the state law also requires that any consumption activity be ceased and the air be cleared out if there needs to be a visit from law enforcement, public health, from whoever. So if people who are not patrons, if someone's coming in for a health emergency, whatever reason, they can ask, and it's actually required that the business comply with any smoking or vaporization or any consumption activity, even edibles, be ceased while those people are on site.
Great, thank you. So let's try to go back to John and see if we can get you to have your mic working, and then we'll jump to the next question. John, do you want to chime in? See if we can hear you. Not hearing anything, John. All right. Is it just me or nobody's dying?
Hey, Molly, this is Ken with All About Hemp. I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about public health, if you're an owner of one of these establishments, are you concerned about the amount of consumption one person takes in, just in case someone has to call an ambulance on someone? Are you responsible to know how much a person consumed? And is there a liability?
I think
Hey, Molly, we can't hear you. Molly, we can't hear you. You have like a horrible echo and
it's just breaking up.
So this
Yeah,
is
you're
actually, why don't we have Anshul talk about that issue, because Ken, we did look at that issue with I-300 and had limits on how much people could bring in, and there is, yes, a concern for liability if someone's intoxicated. Oh, look at John. Yeah. So Anshul, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So this is Anshul. Traditionally, liquor license liability being placed on the establishment that sold the alcohol is a creature of statute. It's called dram shop liability. So that does not exist for places that do marijuana consumption on site, as far as I know. So unless the state legislature were to pass something like that, then the liability would have to be applied via your normal methods of civil litigation. So that's kind of where the liability comes from on that piece. Right now, I think we do have something in the rule that addresses overintoxication and recognition of overintoxication, which would be enforced through general city enforcement methods, civil fines.
Oh, and Anshul too, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what dram shop liability is, if you're a bar or a restaurant and you overserve, you sort of have strict liability for that. In this case, it would be just like regular tort law. They would have to prove that you overserved the person and that you knew that person was overserved, and then you knew the person was getting into a car. So it's a harder case to prove than overserving someone alcohol.
All right, I just left and then came back in. Does that seem to be sounding better?
That sounds much better.
Okay, sorry everybody. Sorry, I missed a little bit there.
We have Henny next. Anshul was just answering a question.
Okay. Go ahead, Henny.
So last summer, when we set the rulemaking for the state discussion, there was quite a bit of discussion from industry members that were dealing with the mobile the mobile unit model because of the concern about the delayed reaction from edibles. And so when we put our comments into the state, we did suggest, after talking to others that were not on the panel that were part of public health and safety, that maybe edibles is something that we should be really thoughtful about because of the delayed reaction. That the state health department has been very clear that there is the delayed impairment reaction for edibles. So I just wanted to bring that point up on the record. And then the second thing is, given that this is a new model where things are going to be sold, is there any consideration or willingness to look at the actual potency of some of the products that are being sold? For example, if you have a tourist that's come into town that may be coming from out of state and may not be prepared for, the high potent marijuana that's now sold in our state. I think the average is nearing 20% for bud. Maybe it's time for us as a city to look at, maybe we follow some of the industry lead on go low, start slow, or whichever way you say it. So those are just some of our comments that we had back on the public health and safety side.
So that's kind of interesting, that piece about edibles. Sarah, you said that, smoking is really important. Is edibles something that somebody would be going to a hospitality establishment like this to consume? Is that an area that someone like Sarah, who's been in the business, would be interested, would say, in the interest of public health, maybe we shouldn't allow edibles?
Are you asking me that question, Ashley?
Yeah.
So I think there's two different, we should allow edibles. We should allow all forms of consumption. I feel like when I-300 first happened, edibles were a lot more popular because the places which at the time 2 places have been licensed, you can only do vape or edibles there. But what I will say, and I feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the few people that do this type of work in the industry, and I have visited all of their establishments, be mobile or brick and mortar. We're really focused on educating our customer prior to a tour, prior to a paint class. I know all of us have people sign waivers. All of us monitor consumption. All of us talk about starting low, go slow. All of us talk about, if you've been doing edibles prior, these are the considerations. We go the extra mile and hand out little Colorado Safe access cards. We try to make sure that we're monitoring consumption and people aren't getting out of their mind when it comes to intoxication. And so I do think that the people that are in this business are taking those factors into consideration, and they're not allowing people just to come in and totally overly indulge on any product, whether if that's an edible, a concentrate, or a flower.
In I-300, how's that? For I-300, we had some stuff about training your employees. So if we didn't have like some restriction on edibles, or we didn't have restrictions on THC level, which I think those are all reasonable things to think about. If we didn't do something, maybe we could do what you're saying, Sarah, and have that like required training for employees of what they need to convey to their, if you're already doing it, make that standard and a requirement to make sure every business is doing it.
And the statute does require a responsible vendor training. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. So yeah, people that really run this business and are serious, we're already taking those extra precautions. But I believe that responsible vendor training is already in the statute.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, are we good to move on to the next one? Seeing a couple nods. Okay. So this is the topic that has come up a little bit already. but just want to give everybody some background and context on a couple of different things. So the question is around what location or proximity requirements should apply to marijuana hospitality establishments. And so particularly in this slide, I think we want to focus the conversation around hospitality establishments and hospitality and sales establishments. Mobile hospitality is a little bit different, and we have a slide coming up about that. But so we're kind of thinking of like the permanent brick and mortar type of establishments when we're having this question here. As several people mentioned earlier on, all businesses in Denver are required to comply with the Denver zoning code, which you know, is it just requires that you identify each type of business has an identified use, and then there are certain districts, zone districts across the city where those types of uses are allowed, and it's you know, it fits with the Denver plan, the blueprint plan of fitting like uses together, and so all businesses have to comply with those. We have it with the designated consumption areas in several different types of uses that are allowed, which you know, we've had those conversations several times and looking at where designated consumption areas are able to go. Some of the policy questions that we think are pretty important are when it comes to public health, having that conversation around whether outlet density increases usage, particularly among youth. And when it comes to youth, also just looking at the impacts and whether we've been seeing changes in underage uses, access, and perception of risk. And for these two particular questions, I think Councilman Hines kind of hit it on the head when he said, you know, this is something when he posed the question of whether to talk about, you know, the policy questions versus the business models. And this is something that we've looked at extensively and talked about over the last several of years. On the next slide, I'll go into some information about what are the proximity requirements that are currently in place for similar license types. But to finish up on this slide, also just want to keep thinking about how the Denver zoning code impacts location limitations, like some people had mentioned around the availability of finding a location and what the Denver zoning code, how that might limit that. That being said, the Denver zoning code is something that you know, is very difficult to change and pretty much out of at least our hands and excise and licenses. But how that zoning code impacts location limitations, equity, and saturation in low-income neighborhoods. And then how do proximity requirements create additional challenges or costs for prospective businesses? So just before we jump into this conversation, a couple of different things around, we looked at some other similar license types and looking at what the proximity requirements are for those. So across the top, you have the license type, and then across the or down the left, you have the different requirements or setbacks. So for marijuana stores and centers, they're required to be 1,000 feet from schools, child care facilities, alcohol and drug treatment facilities, and then other similar establishments. So another marijuana store or another retail store, they're required to be 1,000 feet from those. Those are have been in place pretty since medical, and then again adopted for retail when that was created, when those regulations were created by the City Council in 2013. Looking at alcohol retailers, which is so liquor stores, places for off-site consumption, you have 500 feet for schools and then 1,500 feet for another liquor store. Looking at tobacco retailers, which is a fairly new license that was created in 2019, the proximity requirements that were put in place for those ones were 1,000 feet from schools and 1,000 feet from city pools and rec centers. Looking at designated consumption areas, when this conversation was had in 2016 and 17, we looked back on pretty much what were the requirements for medical stores and centers and adopted those with a few minor adjustments. So they're required to be 1,000 feet from schools and child care facilities, as well as drug and alcohol treatment facilities, just like marijuana stores and centers. However, we also added at that point, based on conversations around city pools and rec centers being very similar to the uses that occur within schools and child care facilities. So those were added at that time. And then we had the conversation in 2016 and 17 around whether these should be required to be 1,000 feet from another designated consumption area. And it was decided at that time that that was not a recommendation and it was not implemented. So that requirement is not there. And then finally, for alcohol consumption or alcohol facilities that allow for on-site consumption for bars, they're required to be 500 feet from schools. So I'll leave that there. Lots of questions, I think, embedded within here. We've already talked about this in a couple of different ways, but really want to hear from you guys what you think about some of these different public health questions in relation to you know, the business models, as Councilman Hines brought up.
Molly, this is Art Way again, Equitable Consulting. You know, I just want to provide some context. I don't think use in and of itself, as well as access, is our main problem. I think our main problem is problematic use. And when it comes to marijuana, problematic use rarely has the public health impact that, say, problematic use of alcohol or tobacco has. There's data that shows people, you know, have no desire to drive while high, especially while at the peak of their high. There's also data that shows the more people consume marijuana, usually the less alcohol they drink. So, you know, I just wanted to be on record with that context as we discuss you know, the issues around use and access. You know, I think when it comes to density, as much as we can mirror alcohol or tobacco, I think we should go that route. There's new state legislation that doesn't allow new tobacco retailers within 500 feet. So the state is a little bit more permissive there than the city of Denver. So, you know, I definitely wouldn't do anything that goes beyond what we see with tobacco and alcohol as substances that really have much more of a detrimental public impact than marijuana does.
Thank
and
you.
Molly, we have Truman, then Sarah Belstock, then Michelle Holino in queue.
Great. And let me just state real quick, I think that tobacco restriction at the state is proposed legislation, not passed legislation. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. For the 500 feet for tobacco, it's proposed. So go ahead, let's start with Truman and then we'll go to Sarah Belstock.
That slide comparing the cannabis establishments to the liquor establishments was awfully telling. And I don't know if that's because, you know, the regulations around cannabis have happened so recently after prohibition, but it's really quite clear that cannabis is safer than alcohol. But if you came into this in a vacuum and you only looked at that slide, you would think the opposite. And I find that very interesting.
Great. So Sarah Belstock.
Yeah, so the question was posed around the relationship between density and consumption, and I think there is a pretty clear relationship. So if that is a public health consideration, you know, we see that relationship very well in terms of outlet density and consumption rates with tobacco, with alcohol, with fast food, and we are in fact beginning to see it with marijuana as well. So I think we can anticipate that any large increases in density will be coupled with increase in consumption. And that is among both adult and youth audiences. And there is also connections with, I appreciate the comments around problematic use, but there is relationship with density and marijuana use disorders among adults too. The other question that I believe was posed is around proximity and youth use. And I think there, you know, we can see that proximity to schools and to residential areas does tend to increase normalization, which in turn is something that might increase youth use. So I don't know that the data points there are necessarily quite as strong in pulling that relationship, but I think that there are, you know, some things we can be cautious of.
So I have, I guess a follow-up question, and maybe I'll be jumping ahead of Michelle a little bit here, but I guess my follow-up question to one of Truman's points as well is just that I mean, reflecting on the proximity requirements for alcohol, do either of you, Michelle or Sarah, have any data? I assume that alcohol usage rates are higher among youth than marijuana usage rates. Yes. Okay. So go ahead, Michelle, if you want to jump in.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so alcohol is still higher than marijuana. However, I did want to comment on the question that's posed on the slide about are we seeing changes in use? And I know I talked about this a little bit last week. We've gotten our 2019 Healthy Kids Colorado data. And for folks that may not know what that is, that's a survey. It's a national survey that was developed by the Centers for Disease Control. And school districts around the country are able to opt in and do it on odd years. And then basically what it looks at is all kinds of behaviors that adolescents engage in. And so we're looking at different risk factors and different types of risky behaviors. And the version we use in Colorado is called Healthy Kids. So kind of a long overview. Anyway, it's not posted on the state site yet. And so any comparisons that I've been able to look at between 2015, 2017, 2019 have just been kind of my own pulling of numbers. But I will say that I feel like we are actually now seeing an increase in youth usage. And I know that there was kind of a lot of relief and excitement when we didn't see that in 2015 and we didn't see it in 2017. But I do think there were also questions out there that made us wonder, well, really, how long would it take for us to see a difference? And so going back to what Sarah was talking about with density, we're definitely seeing increases in density throughout the years. And I also would pose the question about advertising, billboards. How much does that also really play in? I think it's something that we need to think about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about the advertising piece. We probably should have had that included in this conversation.
Question for Michelle. When is that Healthy Kids data going to be official?
I believe it will be up on the state's website by June. I know that individual schools have received their data, districts have received it, and then the next thing that will be released is the state data. And then I think at that point, it's when you can go in and see the state data as well as the different health statistics regions.
Ashley, Jessica from CDPAG said June or July, they're not sure yet. And Molly, we have Dan Pabon on queue.
Well, I have one more question too. So the lag, are you saying that maybe that lag, like you're exactly right. We were so excited. You guys, you know, we in Denver have been really excited to say youth usage has stayed the same and maybe even ticked down a little bit. So was that true to begin with, or was there a lag in reporting? Or was there a lag in the data or something?
I'm sorry, can you clarify that question?
So
I'm not necessarily understanding it.
Yeah. Is it accurate that the past couple of years youth usage stayed about the same, or is it just that's the data hadn't caught up to what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. Anecdotally, what we hear from our students all the time is that they're underreporting in that survey. Even though it's anonymous, there's still this sense of, I'm sitting in a classroom answering these questions. Traditionally, it's been done on paper. And so I think we have heard anecdotally from students that they're still underreporting. The question I raise around the lag is, could we potentially now be seeing an increase in use because enough time has passed, enough normalization has passed, as we're starting to see more and more dispensaries, greater density, more advertising. I think it is the $1 million question, but I do think it's something we need to consider.
Thanks.
So we have Dan and then Councilman Hines, and obviously would love to hear from the group on just kind of that information and thoughts about it. So, but go ahead, Dan.
Dan Pavone, Medicine Man Technologies. I wasn't going to plan to comment on the data as far as the Healthy Kids data or anything like that. I was going to go back to the barriers to entry and the zoning restrictions. But I will just make one quick comment, which is I think it's important that we all have an opportunity to look at the data and ensure that we have a chance to digest it, understand it, and then use it to guide us. I just think it's always a challenge, and especially in this era where folks throw out statistics on the news and TV all the time, and we're just in a place where I think it's important that we just all are on the same page with respect to that information. So I would just state that as not as anything else, but if the youth use has gone up, like, let's look at it and let's figure out why that is, where that is. But I just haven't seen the information, so I can't really opine. What I wanted to comment on, and this probably deserved a statement back a few slides just about the barriers to entry and equity considerations, but because it's been couched as a zoning issue or a setback issue, I think it's important to raise it here because I don't see it in the other slides, which is the real constraints that you have aside from the setbacks, which to Truman's point are night and day with respect to alcohol, is not necessarily the zoning code and the setbacks, but the building codes. And just as an example, if you take over a new a building that is, in this case, would be a change of use of that building because there's never been a consumption place in Denver, you will be required to update that building to current building code. So that includes electrical, that includes ventilation, that includes foundational issues. And so from just a very basic entry point, the real estate is going to be very expensive for these locations. And then the upgrades that either an owner will have to take up or a tenant in these places is going to be astronomical. And so I just want to raise that as an issue because the setbacks, the zoning code generally are, again, factors that contribute to it, but a major entry point that deters most business folks is the level of building code upgrade that they have to do in order to get these licenses. And so, if you're worried about the proliferation of these businesses just happening all over Denver, just using the building code as a point of entry is going to stop most of these, most folks from just opening them up anywhere that there's zoning or setback restrictions. There's another layer of consideration there. That's all.
Well, and I think too what Sarah said about if a landlord's going to be willing to rent to you, if you're going to be smoking inside, some landlords might have some hesitancy about that, like they did about grows and other things initially because of the odor and stuff. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
We have Councilman Hyde. Yeah, and then Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Chris Hines, Denver City Council. Just about setbacks, I think I've been pretty open about setbacks and how I believe they're too restrictive for cannabis right now. By being pretty open, I even testified in front of the previous City Council regarding that. And so I think it's pretty clear for people who are following the Denver City Council that District 10 went from a hard no to a pretty solid yes on cannabis. And just one other quick comment about the testifying is I think that while it's relevant to talk about agreements with the previous council, I think that they may not be totally applicable to this council. Regarding Denver Health's comment about proximity, I wonder, is it proximity or is it proximity to demonstrated consumption. And I think that those are not necessarily the same, because I get a lot of comments and complaints, and frankly, I observe consumption in our parks and in Civic Center, in Cheeseman. I see it on our sidewalks along Colfax, which all of those are in my district. And I hear, concerns from constituents about how it's happening around them, around their families, and around future generations, our kids and grandkids. But I think really, from a public health perspective, I think that this is an argument more for consumption sites, and making sure that they are in a place where they're accessible for people who want to consume, so long as the consumption is in a place where it is not visible and is not, detectable, I guess, so not smells either to the area around it. So I think that there could be the data there, and there could be a case made for reduced setbacks at the same time. And I think to Mr. Babone's point about data, I think it is important for us to make that available to the public. The last thing about Mr. Babone's comment about the level of building code upgrades, I think that's unrelated to, his comments have a lot of merit, including to this conversation, something that I would say that isn't necessarily related to cannabis, but more just about building codes in general, is I also would like to access buildings that are in Denver, that are available to the public, that Denver has said are available to the public, but that aren't wheelchair accessible unless they're modernized to current building codes. So just throwing that out there, I think that it has some relevance to this conversation. I think that there's a way larger conversation that we could have that maybe doesn't fit inside this working group. Thank you.
So I'm gonna, Sarah Bellstock commented that she has a quick response to Councilman's comment around proximity. So I'll let Sarah Bellstock go, and then we'll go back to you, Sarah Woodson, in just a moment. Go ahead, Sarah Bellstock.
Thank you. This is Sarah Bellstock with Denver Public Health. I think that's a great question regarding proximity and kind of proximity to visible use. And I suspect that both play a role in normalization. I also think that there are probably ways to mitigate some of the proximity issues with in terms of like proximity of social consumption location, just in terms of what signage looks like and things like that. So I think that there are probably ways to mitigate some of those impacts. But I do think proximity as a whole plays a role in normalizing.
You're cutting a lot, Molly. No, you're still cutting, so I'm just gonna turn off to Sarah Woodson and see if we can fix yours, okay? Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Dan Pabon said. I absolutely agree with him when it comes to having to upgrade a building and the expenses being huge. But in my personal experience, and I don't know if there's data to support this or not, what I've noticed is the upgrades that you have to make to a building have a lot to do with where the building is zoned at and the proximity of the building. So for instance, if you're able to put a social consumption space in a strip mall, which the zoning rarely ever would allow, and then the landlord would have to say yes, what I've noticed is that when the landlord does say yes, of course, they want to charge you the same amount that they want to charge a traditional marijuana business. And so now you have this huge costly lease that you're paying. But when they are not in more upgraded spaces and the landlord says yes too, you then have to get them into, compliance. They have to be handicap accessible. And so all those things come into play. But if you have better zoning, you have better access to newer and more modern, updated spaces. So yeah, you might have this landlord price gouging you for rent, but some of the pieces of getting your space into the proper permitting and getting your business up and running, when it comes to those constructions costs, they may not be there if you have more opportunity to be zoned in better places. So that's just something to also take into consideration too.
Said, hey, thanks, Sarah. I see Bea put me live since Molly's not doing well right now, or I think she's doing fine, but her microphone is having a problem. So does anybody else have anything that they would like to add to this proximity conversation before we go on to the next slide? And Bea, I don't know if we can go on to the next slide if Molly's computer's not up. Are you trying?
It will be hard to hear you. It's really hard to hear you too. So just give me a second. I'm trying to see if there is anything here. There's no one in queue, so I say we just take this time since Molly's off to take a 5-minute bathroom break, and then as soon as Molly's back on, we can return the live event if that works for everyone.
That sounds great. So it's 2:16, so you want us back at 2:21?
No, it's 2:59. I want us back at 2:03, 2:04?
2:04.
3:03, 2:04.
Good. Great conversation, everyone. Yeah, it's been good. Whew.
Maybe, is that better?
Yes, this is much better. Now let me just see if I can put you, have your video up, and then if you want to pull the next PowerPoint as well.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, it was fine for a little while, right? And then it got worse again.
Yeah, exactly. But you were perfect now. I can hear you. It's great. And I can also have access to your PowerPoint. So let's we gave people until 3:03. So another 2 or 2.5 minutes, and then we can go back.
Are we done with the proximity? Are we moving on from that?
We didn't have any other people who requested comments. So I'd say let's go to the next slide.
Okay. So you can control the slides now?
No. I can control what goes live. I can put your live.
Hey, Molly,
yep.
Maybe before you go on to the next slide, look at one of Joey's questions in the text. I think it's a good thought we could cover.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to ask when I got all messed up. So, but yep, I'll come back to that.
Very good. And I'm putting y'all on mute.
And Molly, it's 3:03. We said it would be back, so if you want to circle back on your question.
Okay, so hi everybody, sorry about that. Hopefully this is now more clear, and we just have another 25 minutes or so, so we'll finish this up and hopefully you guys can hear me a little bit better now. So to close out the conversation on proximity restrictions, I didn't hear the last couple of comments as I got kicked out. But just to close the conversation out a little bit, I guess I would love to hear from the group. You know, we've got some data that we'll get some clarification on, and I'll kind of dig into a little bit before we move forward too much. But we've got some data around potential increases in youth usage. We've heard from Sarah Belstock some data around increased usage as a result of outlet density. We've got some long-standing knowledge that alcohol consumption is higher among youth than it is for marijuana, and we know that the distance or the proximity requirements are lower for alcohol than they are for marijuana, and so we're seeing that, you know, maybe reflected in usage. And so we know there's some limitations that are there from the zoning code. So we'd just kind of love to hear what some suggestions are for solutions and resolutions to kind of all this conflicting information around business models and lack of locations and zoning code and some of the data that we have available. I don't know who all's back from break, but if anybody wants to chime in. Let's see, it looks like Truman is available to comment.
Hi, you sound great, Molly. So
great, thanks.
Whatever happened on the break, good job. I would be really careful drawing causation to correlation. You know, we haven't seen the study. We don't know why that is. It might be that for the first time, you know, kids feel comfortable actually telling the truth in these studies and that usage is not in fact going up. I really don't know. Like Dan said, I haven't been able to see the study. And so I would caution this group about, you know, drawing conclusions from data that some folks have seen, some folks haven't. And then I think there's a pretty clear concern about correlation versus causation. You know, there are a million funny memes out there about things that have nothing to do with each other that are correlated, but have no direct cause. And so, you know, I'm happy to expand on that further. But in terms of density and usage, I think Councilman Hines put it well that people are consuming cannabis. We know this. It's happening now in parks because there's just nowhere to go. If you can do it in your home, great. That's really the only place. And so, you know, where do you want these people to do it? I guess that's my point. There just aren't a lot of great options here. And so I think that I would encourage the city of Denver to consider places where people can consume legally because they're going to do it anyway. That's just a fact.
Well, and this is actually, I mean, I think we are doing that. The question is more particular into what would you recommend? You know, we can just kind of find out what people say, or people can send in an email. What would you recommend for proximity restrictions? And so say the data, say you do see the data and you do agree with the data, and it does look like youth usage has gone up by a certain percentage, let's say 5 or 10. You know, would you have one decision if it went up 5 percentage points and you believe that and thought it was accurate, and a different decision if it went up 10 percentage points, or would it not impact your decision on proximity restrictions?
I definitely consider myself to be data driven, and for that reason, you know, I would wait respectfully to see the data. I think that that's important, and I'm happy to take a look at it. You know, I think about this stuff all the time, so happy to take a look at it. In terms of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
We haven't seen it either, and so that's what I was thinking while we were just on that break. Should we make this sort of a parking lot issue until we get the data, and hope we get the data quickly? You know, but if we had some parameters, if some people said, if you said, wow, if youth usage went up 50%, I'd want to really relook at some of this stuff, you know, or not. Or if it went up 5%, I would or I wouldn't. Because I'm thinking, like you said, we should be data driven. We should wait till we have the data. We should wait till everybody sees it. We could just kind of pause the proximity restriction conversation until then. But I'd love to get some like high level thoughts before we move on.
This is my last thing, and then I'll shut up and let other people chime in. You know, I guess what I would say is the data about teen usage is super important to all discussions of cannabis, but what we're talking about is adults consuming cannabis not in the home. It's possible that would actually reduce the usage of teen use because number one, teens aren't allowed in there. Number two, only 1 out of 3 license types being considered allows for the purchase of cannabis. And so this may well be taking cannabis out of the home and into a place where minors are strictly forbidden. You can't see it from the public. There are a lot of guardrails in here. So even if the data does show an increase in teen usage, I'm not sure that it directly pertains to what we're talking about in this conversation.
Thanks for those comments.
And we have Michelle Helene, Sarah Woodson, Michelle Garcia, and then Councilwoman Sidbaka wrote something on the chat about why don't you all use polls with this group after we get the data. So I don't know if Molly want to respond to that, but I guess I'm going to kick it off to Michelle Helene.
Thanks, Bea. My recommendation would be to look at advertising, as I mentioned earlier. I think there's been a lot of research that shows that the greater the amount of advertising for alcohol, the greater the amount of consumption for both adults and youth. And I realize that really this is so much bigger than this one particular issue of hospitality. But if we're looking at ways to mitigate some of the other concerns, I do think advertising is something that needs to be considered.
Thanks, Michelle.
I think next we had Sarah Woodson and then Michelle Garcia and then Jessica, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, guys. So I do agree with everyone. We need to be able to review the data. What I do want to recommend, though, is based on the data that you guys put up with proximity restrictions for alcohol versus marijuana. I believe her name was Molly. I'm sorry, but she had said that there's still use is still up with alcohol consumption with minors, right? And when we looked at that chart, we saw that liquor stores could be 500 feet away from a school. I think maybe daycare, but I'm for sure school. So what I would suggest is changing it from the 1,000, because I think that's way too restrictive, but possibly doing like maybe a 750 feet or an 800 feet. That would allow for more people to have an opportunity to open more businesses in possibly places that have already had newer construction. And so that would help with equity, I think. And I also believe that that would help with still the concerns about how is density going to affect consumption with teens, but also looking at where we are with alcohol and consumption. So kind of having a in between the two. And that would be my recommendation without having looked at any data.
Okay, I've lost track of where we were. Michelle Garcia.
Michelle. So is the data going to give us a level of specificity such that we'll be able to determine if kids proximate to sales sites smoke in greater proportion than kids who are miles? So if it's not going to tell us that, then we're making a huge assumption that proximity has anything to do. Do we even know if most teens buy from legal establishments using fake IDs, or are they getting it from parents, siblings, friends? I mean, I guess I'm not seeing the connection between proximity and teen use in that way. Is there survey data that would let us know where the young people are procuring their marijuana?
I think you bring a really good point up. I think you bring up a really good point, Michelle, around what Tormil was saying around causation versus correlation, but I think it also goes back to Sarah Belstock's point around the outlet density and whether just the proximity and the the normalization of all those different outlets and the volume of outlets, whether that increases it. And so, I mean, there are a lot of different data points all kind of converging together, and you know, it takes a long time to get long-term data to tell us that information around correlation. And so, but these are all just things that we have to take into consideration when we're developing our proposals. But you guys have given us a lot of great information to think about. So let's go on to Jessica, and then it looks like we have Henny.
Hi, thank you. Jessica Scardina, Vicente Cedarburg. I just wanted to add that if this is a license type that the city is going to offer, I think it's important, regardless of the data, to not regulate it out of existence. There's some pretty restrictive setback requirements in place already for stores and for the DCAs, and it essentially rendered I-300 ineffective. So I would just caution you to keep that in mind when developing setbacks for these types of facilities. And I wanted to address Michelle's point too with respect to advertising. I just wanted to note that the MED regulations contain pretty comprehensive advertising restrictions for marijuana facilities. So I would encourage you to at least align those to some extent.
Great, thank you. So Henny, and then Art, and Truman, and then I'll answer Councilman Hines' question, but go ahead, Henny.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, and I apologize, I was trying to pull up the last state data. And the one thing, there is a percentage, I think Michelle asked about where kids are actually getting their marijuana from. And, you know, they do get it from parents, they do get it from someone else, they buy it from someone else. So that data is there from 2017. But I would like to make a comment that the 2017 data also showed that of the kids that reported use, the trend towards the higher potent concentrate market is also tracking the adult market. And so the 30, I think it was 30, if this is off the top of my head, that 33% of the kids that reported using marijuana in the last 30 days at the state level were actually dabbing. And so there was a statistically significant increase in dabbing from 2015 to 2017, along with edibles. So it's tracking, if you look at the MED sales data, where the market's about half and half anyway, we're seeing that kids are gravitating towards the products that are available in the licensed market. So I just wanted to bring that up. And you know, the Healthy Kids Colorado data that will be published in 2019. You know, it's always challenging because of the timing of the when the data set is released, because it's always after the legislative session or it's, you know, in the midst of something. So, but it's going to be important for everybody to look at, because all of our common goals was to make sure that we kept licensed product out of the hands of kids.
Great, thank you. So let's do Art and then Truman, and then we'll hop into one more question before we close.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, I think if our youth in Colorado are more educated on problematic use, cannabis use disorder, and the complexities of drug dependency in general, you know, I think we're winning in that situation, even despite maybe even a slight uptick in use. So, you know, I would just want to say, keep the focus on education as opposed to allowing what often isn't even statistically relevant rises in use to really impact our policy.
Okay, let's see, I think it was Truman.
Thanks, yeah. Appreciate Henny bringing up the recent Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division annual update that came out earlier this month. So page 15 of that actually shows the non-qualified sales check investigations that the MED ran. They doubled the number of sting operations, a little bit north of 600. and 97% pass rate with the licensees, up from a 92% pass rate last year in 2018. So it's pretty clear that it's not easy to get an underage sale in the current licensed market. And I'm happy to send that report to anybody. It's available on the MED website.
Sarah Bellstock.
I just want to quickly add, and this is a similar comment as I made during our delivery conversation, is that I think with any of these changes, I think it's going to be important for us to have a system for monitoring any increases in uses across our population groups, so youth as well as others, and to have a cadence for reviewing that information and for putting prevention infrastructures in place if and when needed.
Agreed. Thank you.
Ian next, Molly.
Yep.
Thanks, Bia. Thanks, Molly. I just want to speak from a state standpoint in terms of compliance and regulation. As Truman alluded to, and I think I mentioned it on the last call, that there is an extremely high compliance rate as it specifically as it relates to serving unidentified or underage youth. It appears to have a very, very high compliance rate. And I just want to add that I think the Marijuana Enforcement Division plans to be just as insistent for high levels of compliance, if not even more, for these types of licenses in the beginning, recognizing that it's going to be a new experience and they're going to need to work hand in hand with operators who choose to engage in that. So I just want to be clear that from the state standpoint, I think that the state has done a pretty good job of regulating cannabis in general over the past decade. And there's no reason to think that the state won't be able to regulate this effectively from a compliance standpoint as it relates to some of the issues that are being addressed here today in this working group.
Okay, sorry, it takes a long time for my computer to unmute, so thank you. So John Bailey has shared some comments that I would, since he's able to, or not able to be heard, I'm just going to kind of read real quickly. And again, just a reminder to everybody, you're welcome to submit comments in written form after this, especially if you didn't feel like you had an opportunity, or if there's something we didn't spend enough time on. So, and they'll all be shared with the full work group members as well. So feel free to share that way as well. But what John wanted to say, since he's not able to be heard through the platform, he just wanted to say that the information coming forth is that there are so many divergent points of view, yet all worthy, to make sure we send forward in-depth information forward to council and the mayor for consideration based on questions raised in the documents from the city, as well as comments and questions from the work group. There should be a focus towards pros and cons of all points raised. The conversation is good, however, driven by people's personal experiences. I'm not sure that all the data suggests our discussion has merit currently, therefore best practices, pros and cons should be where we ultimately try to get to. So that's from John Bailey. So let's see, we just have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to hop into one last quick question, and we won't have time to get to all of them. So again, feel free to add your comments, but let's pick one where we can kind of get through it quickly, which is, let's do this, sales restrictions. And so should there be any additional sales restrictions on sales limits in hospitality and sales? So this is just limited to the one model that does allow for sales to occur, and the MED rule sets the sales limits at 2 grams of marijuana flower, 1/2 gram of concentrate, and marijuana products containing 20 milligrams of THC. It also allows a customer to leave with any unconsumed marijuana as long as it has been properly packaged and labeled by the establishment. So anything that remains unconsumed can be brought out of the establishment as long as it is packaged again. Public health considerations, public safety considerations, and again, the same considerations on impacts on youth. Anything different that anybody has an opinion about from doing something different than what the state limitations have been put on for the hospitality and sales establishments? All good? All right. Do we want to try to do one more then? Talk about outdoor operations. I feel like the retail food one would get us down. So then we'll open this one up around outdoor consumption for hospitality and sales establishments. So the MED rule requires that marijuana is kept out of plain sight and is not visible from a public place without the use of optical aids, and that the consumption area is surrounded by a sight obscuring wall, fence, hedge, or other opaque or translucent barrier. Currently, our designated consumption areas are permitted to operate in an outdoor licensed premise as well as at a special event licensed premise. It has similar requirements as the MED rule around not viewable from a public place, and all of the same similar considerations. So any thoughts about outdoor areas of consumption? No? All right, well then we'll just end it with any other thoughts in general around marijuana hospitality licensing that people would like to share in the last 6 minutes that we have, or I guess if anybody wants to mention some topics from our meeting from 2 weeks ago, that would be fine in these last couple of minutes as well. Feel free to speak up if you want to chime in.
So, hey, Molly, is that for that presentation, or we have a few more things to go to discuss?
I mean, I can run through. There was one other question around retail food establishments, I think was the last one. That was the last one we didn't touch on. I'm happy to go through that.
Well, that's the last one. We have 5 minutes.
Sure. I think that was, yep. So this is pretty much the last one. So should Denver permit retail food establishments to operate a marijuana hospitality establishment? So for this one, we're thinking about the hospitality establishments and then the hospitality and sales, and some kind of sub questions of that would be hours of operation, methods of consumption, location restrictions, and whether they be able to operate outdoors. So some of the similar questions that we've talked about in the previous slides, but specific to ones that are operating in retail food establishments. So the MED rule prohibits a marijuana hospitality establishment from operating in a retail food establishment that holds a liquor license, and requires that the licensed premise of a marijuana hospitality establishment be separated from the rest of the retail food establishment by a sight obscuring barrier and a secure door, and prohibits marijuana from being added to food served by the retail food establishment. So that's kind of what's out there for retail food establishments and the considerations around public health, safety, impacts on youth, and customer and patient interest. It looks like we have a comment from Sean and Dan.
I think the food service component is very important from a, wait, can you hear me? Oh, yeah. It's very important from a business viability perspective. And also it's, I mean, first of all, I mean, if you're selling food, that's an opportunity to have a business, right? So just from that perspective alone, I think it's very important for business viability. But I also think when we're talking about the issue of normalization, the question is, what are we normalizing, right? Are we normalizing people being social, people being active, people being in a healthy environment, sharing a good time, or we're normalizing something else? Because when I think about, for example, for those who were around at the beginning of in 2014, when we had classically cannabis, for example, where people were going around to a concert with chamber music and fine food and things like that. what's wrong with normalizing that concept, right? Where it's fine dining and a good experience where people feel like they should wear a suit and tie. In order to ensure that we can normalize activities and behaviors that we would like to see people engage in, it's one thing to talk about what we don't want people to do. We should also be talking about what we would like people to do, engage, and encourage. So I think from that perspective, having food service is vitally important.
Yeah, this is Dan Pabon from Medicine Man Technologies. Just a real quick comment on the considerations stakeholders. So, and I just picked up on this on the retail food establishments, which was, lists the number of public health, public safety impacts on youth, and also consumer, patient, and visitor interest. And I'm just curious or just recommending that on all of these slides, especially when we get to the social equity discussion, that customers, patients, interests are also considerations that we have. And I'll just give a quick example. So when we were looking at hospitality and sales restrictions, we had considerations, public health, public safety, impacts on youth, but we did not have customer, patients, and visitor interests. So I just think I would just recommend we be consistent in our considerations and that we, at the end of the day, think about who we're serving and, who's ultimately walking in the doors of these locations. So I just want to, if we can try to, cover those in our next discussions, I think that would be helpful just to be consistent.
Sorry, where did you say it was missing from?
So I just looked quickly at a couple of the slides. So it's on hospitality and sales, but it's not on mobile hospitality, location, and proximity.
Okay.
Clarissa Creek here with National Cannabis Industry Association. I have a question about alcohol, because it looks to be originated from a Denver RFE license, but a lot of these I'm going to assume do hold liquor licenses, and it is my understanding that these don't really combine under the language. So this is just something for us to consider as we, because I mean, there being food in the establishment is a no-brainer, like Sean said, but I'm reading this differently. I'm reading this, a retail food establishment that already has a license can then acquire cannabis consumption license. Am I reading this inaccurately?
Sorry, it takes a long time. No, I think that's my understanding of it as well, is that they could add it. I mean, there's all those limitations that are listed there, but and then they can't hold a liquor license. Any other closing thoughts from the group that we want to jump into? And just as a reminder, I can put up the slide right now showing the email address of where to send your comments to, which is right here. So marijuanainfo@denvergov.org. Please, members of the public, send your written comments to there. I believe the template for today's questions is already out there on the website, and members of the public as well as work group members are free to use that template to provide us your comments. So if that's it, we'll adjourn and see you all on June 11th. We'll get the information out towards the end of next week with the presentation for that meeting, as well as minutes and everything from today.
Great. Thank you, Molly.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. It was good to see you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. It's a great discussion.
Bye, everyone. That was great.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.